Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it should be said good evening. My name is Sumrall. I'm the Director of Education Outreach and Research for Pig Brig Trap Systems, and I want to welcome you to the inaugural run of our webinar series that we will be kicking off tonight. That will occur monthly. A couple of housekeeping things that we want to kick off the event with tonight is to let you know that if you have questions as we go through the event, to use the Q&A feature there that's on your screen to enter those questions. And when we get to the end of the webinar content part, then we'll go back through there and answer those questions that are on the Q&A. A couple of things that we need to also keep in mind is that a few days after this recording, we will have that available for you to watch on demand, or if you want to share that with anybody that you think that may have an interest in what we're talking about tonight, and pass that word along. So with that, what we'll do, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. And first topic that we're going to cover in our efforts this time is going to be our site selection, trap maintenance, and just trapping in general. Some big bullet points as we go through. And again, too, if you have questions as we move through there, then use that Q&A feature to put those out there. So with that, what we're going to do is kick off straight into this activity or this event with site selection. Site selection is pretty much one of those major components that we need to make sure that we get right before we can expect elevated success levels as we move through that trapping effort. So right now, I mean, where I'm at now on the Texas Gulf Coast, it's been warm for quite a while right now. And so I know that some of you that may have pigs in those northern latitudes and whatnot, that you may still have some time with some cooler weather and all. But what we need to think about is keeping those animals cool, keeping those feral hogs cool in that trap once they've been in that trap for a while. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind as we want to keep those pigs cool is if you do not have the ability to I guess put it in an opportune location where you have some overhanging canopy to keep them cool, then we can take that pig brig and unzip that pig brig with that feature there on the side with the stainless steel, that aircraft cable, and encompass or encircle some trees and brush and build in some shade for those animals while they're in that trap. The next thing that we need to think about too is that right now heat stress could be a major issue with pigs in the trap. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an elevated temperature out there to cause heat stress on pigs that could lead to death of those animals. It could be just direct sunlight and prolonged direct sunlight. So we need to make sure that we try to keep the pigs in the shade as best we can. And if you do not have the opportunity to be able to encircle trees or use overhanging canopy to give those pigs some shade, one of the things I like to do is tuck that trap up against that eastern wood line. If you have typical agriculture fields or hay meadows or anything like that, go to the eastern side of that field and tuck that trap right up against that wood line. That way, as that sun starts to rise in the morning, that you've got that prolonged shade cover for those pigs, at least a little bit later until you can get there, which obviously we want to make sure we get to those pigs as quickly as possible in the morning. So next thing we want to move on to there is looking for what we call a widowmaker. For those of us that's got quite a few trees around where we're at, we understand what the term widowmaker means. It's just we want to be observant to that trap location and making sure that those trees that are immediately above that trap doesn't have any rotten tops or large limbs or anything like that could break out at any given time. And obviously, first and foremost is the safety of you. We want to make sure that you stay safe. And then the second is we want to make sure that those animals in that trap are maintained and the integrity of that location is maintained. In the wintertime, it can be tougher to tell. If we've got some trees there that drop their leaves in the wintertime and it's tougher to tell if those limbs or those tops are dead, just err on the side of caution and try to move a little bit further away. You're not really getting a lot of shade cover for those pigs in the winter times after those leaves have fallen off those trees. So we want to move a little bit further away if there's anything in question. Other things to keep in mind too could be that if you are trapping around pines and cedar and things like that, evergreen type trees, think about where you're at. Could ice build up be an issue in the wintertime? And that ice weight could make that treetop break out, those heavier limbs break out. Now we'll move on to the soil type. Main thing that we want to keep in mind when we think about soil type is just the length of those posts that we need to use. So if you're somewhere in the area that you may have a really deep sugar sand, we need to think about those T-post length. We always want to say that we want to use that 6.5 foot T-post as a base post. If you have clay ground or a sandy or loam, more of a tighter type ground, a 6.5 foot post is sufficient to do the good job. But if we've got a deep sugar sand, then what we want to do is use a 7-foot post as a minimum. Then when we start thinking about our ground anchors, if you're just using a single ground anchor there adjacent to that post, you want to make sure that that ground anchor is buried as deep as you can. Some other tips and tricks that you may want to try there with regard to those ground anchors is, rather than putting one ground anchor in direct line with that T-post to attach your cam strap to, may want to use 2 ground anchors that are separated by 8 or 10 inches or so, that make kind of a teepee shape in the center that you attach that cam strap to. Other options to use in deep sugar sand as far as those anchor posts is just use a second T-post and orient that T-post at a 45-degree angle facing away from the trap, and drive that T-post on deeper into that sugar sand. So there's a couple of ideas to kind of keep in mind. Another thing that, as you're looking at your soil type, to keep in mind with regard to site selection is kind of remember back in that particular site, if that area has been shredded before. If that area has been shredded, there very well could be some woody plant stems that are still there that have been shredded off, that may only be a few inches tall. And in those situations there with those woody stumps, those smaller woody stumps, they can bind up in your nets and your skirting at the bottom and cause some concerns there. Just doesn't allow that skirt to flow up and down those floor anchors the way that it needs to. So if there's any of those woody stumps like that, make sure you take some limb lock or anything like that and move those on out of the way before you get started. So then we're moving on to the landscape concerns. Some of the things to think about is pinch points. For those of us that like to bow hunt, whatnot, we know what those pinch points mean. That's just where that it could be almost like an hourglass shape, where you have larger wood locks on either side with a narrowing point in the middle. And those animals tend to filter down into that narrowing point, which allows them to stay more protected, more hidden in those narrowing points without exposing themselves for too long. So if you're in an area that may be somewhat more of an agriculture area that doesn't have those wood locks around there or existing timber or whatnot, you may only be able to use those existing fence lines. There's some usually brush along those fence lines in most capacities, or along an irrigation canal. There could be some brush there that one, it's going to allow you some shade cover. And then so we need to think about orienting that trap to catch that early morning shade. If you can't be able to incorporate vegetation into that trap location, so think about the side of the fence that you need to be on if you have that option, and not jump on your neighbor's side that may not want you over there. Then what we'd also think about with trapping along or orienting those traps along those fence lines is that with that being the only vegetation there, those animals have a higher tendency to use those fence lines to stay protected as they move through the landscape. So then moving on down to those of you that are trapping around livestock, if you're thinking about where your trap should be or how to position those traps, or where to look at potential sites with regard to livestock on the property, if you are in a cattle or a livestock, sheep or goat, it doesn't matter. If it's in a livestock rotation system, then what we want to do is trap behind the rotation of that livestock. And the reason for that is obviously in front of the rotation, your vegetation, grassy vegetation, is going to be a lot higher. So you have a lot more thatch layer that's on the ground that doesn't allow that net to be able to get all the way to the ground the way that it would properly need to be. And so behind that rotation, a couple of things that obviously we're going to have less vegetation after those livestock animals move through. Another thing is going to be behind the rotation. A lot of individuals, a lot of farmers and ranchers out there supplement feed their livestock. So any undigested grain or anything like that's going to pass through that animal and feces and manure piles on the landscape, and those pigs will go back through and use those manure piles and get that undigested grain out. Another thing that'll happen in the summertime with regard to livestock rotation and those manure piles, like now, a lot of that wintertime supplemental feeding is over. So one of the other concerns that we have right now is the possibility of drought. And under those manure piles is where it's going to be the coolest and hold the most moisture. So that's where you're going to find your invertebrates, like your your bugs, your beetles, your worms and things like that. So you can really quickly tell if pigs are in an area because those manure piles will be busted or turned over with those animals looking for the nutrition under there. Moving on to the water concerns or considerations there, we always want to make sure that we trap downhill of ponds or tanks, water bodies of any type. And mainly what we're doing here is obviously we're going to try to mitigate against I guess the influence of diseases or bacteria or anything like that moving from your trap location into that water body. So trapping downhill of those water bodies or on the same topographical line as those water bodies will minimize the possibility that we can have water contamination. If a trap is used in a given area for a very long period of time and you have a smaller livestock pond or tank at the bottom of the hill, you could see some sedimentation into that livestock tank over a period of time if that trap stays in that given area. Now, the next thing I'll obviously do whenever as you listen to more of these webinars as we move through, and I will obviously indefinitely point out where I think I could have done a little bit better job. And I think on this last bullet point on this slide and the first bullet point on the next slide is something that I think I probably should have put these on the same slide. And what I mean by that is that whenever we start thinking about where the bedding areas and the next point on the next slide are going to be where are those feeding areas and how do we orient the trap according to bed and feed. For me, what I want to make sure of that I never do is I never put the traps in direct locations of active bedding or active feeding. And the way I'll explain that is to kind of use an analogy of you and your house. You spend some time in the bedroom and you spend some time in the kitchen. So you know exactly what new additions are in the bedroom and what new additions are in the kitchen. But as you get up in the morning and you make your way in the hallway to the kitchen to that coffee pot, how often do you pay attention to new additions along the hallway? New pictures, new things like that are along that hallway. And pigs are a lot in the same way, is that as they're in that bedding area, they pay really close attention to what's going on in that bedding area, and the same as they do in that feeding area. And so they're going to notice a lot of new additions, a lot of new sights, smells, sounds, things like that in those two locations, bedding and feeding. Where whenever we need to think about in those trap placements is we need to look at where do we need to get close to a bedding or close to a feeding area without getting into the middle of it and bumping those pigs off. Driving T-post and spreading smell around and so forth in an active bedding or feeding area quite likely can bump those animals out of that area for a period of time. Quite often we hear people that say they had pigs active in an area and they put the traps up and the pigs seem to have moved out. And it may have been that they've gotten too close to that bedding or close to that feeding area and putting that trap up. So a good indicator of knowing where those active bedding areas are is in the daytime, those pigs have a monogastric system, much like what we do, a simple stomach system. So they don't have a lot of gas in the tank to be able to get them from daylight until dark till they feed again. So pigs will bed up in an area in the daytime that's pretty protected, but they'll still have to get up at some point during the middle of the day to do some minimal foraging around to keep that tank somewhat full, at least on a quarter of a tank anyway, to make it till dark. So if you're in an area you think may be an active bedding area, one, it's going to be in somewhat close proximity to water. And the second thing it's going to be is extremely deep, fresh rootings. They're going to continue to dig up the same ground over and over because they don't want to expose themselves while they're in that bedding area. So they'll tend to use that area far more heavily during that bedding time. So we move on to the ag side of things, the ag fields and other significant food sources. Pigs will only bed as far away from a significant food sources as what they have to. Pigs are lazy. So yeah, if they have to travel 10 miles to find feed, they're going to travel that 10 miles to get what they need. If that nutrition is readily available, they're only going to remove themselves from that food source far enough to be safe, I guess, in their own pig mind, that if it's common activity on that ag field, and it has during the daytime all day long, but they know that they're safe, 100 yards outside of that ag field, that's where they're going to be. So from bed to feed doesn't have to be a long distance. So what we need to think about there is that if there's active farming, you need to maybe place your traps closer to the feeding areas where we know that bedding could still occur anywhere. But if they're coming to those active fields that are heavily manicured, I guess if you want to call it that, or highly productive with ag, they're going to come to those fields in those warmer months like we're in now. So you may want to stay somewhat closer to those ag fields and not really so much worry too much about where those bedding areas are. An easy way to find out how they're using that field is just take an afternoon off and take the wife, the kids, the grandkids, and go set at a distance off those ag fields with a pair of binoculars and see where those pigs are entering the fields, or say a little while after dark and pick them up on thermal, and you can figure out where those pigs are entering the ag fields and just get somewhere in that proximity to where they're at off that ag field a little ways. What they'll do is, as those animals are start making their way to those ag fields to feed at night, they'll get up and start to kind of a little bit forage a little bit along the way to those ag fields. With, if your trap is in the location between bedding and feeding off that ag field, they'll check up, stage up there for a little while, and your successes are pretty high as they're on their way to get to those opportune feeding locations. Next thing comes to mind in trap site selection is, will anyone else be on the property? And whenever I say that, there's a couple of things that come to mind with this. Is, don't let anybody else know where your traps are and when you're trapping. And the reason I say that is because people get extremely excited sometimes with trapping efforts and whatnot. And quite often it happens whenever I'm working with a landowner that they have kids or grandkids or whatnot that get super excited and doesn't have access to a camera, and they'll want to run down a half a dozen different times throughout the day or the night just to check to see if anything's in that trap. Others that know where those traps are and they do things like that will bump those animals off those traps and decrease your success substantially. Other things that we need to think about with people knowing where you're trapping is safety. It's a major safety concern, because it could be that somebody doesn't like the idea that those animals are in those traps, or that you're trapping and may try to go down there and let those animals out. And they need to keep in mind, everyone needs to keep in mind that that wild pigs, feral hogs, are a wild species, and whenever they're cornered, they're not, if given the chance to run, they're going to. But if they feel that they're cornered and the only way that they have to protect themselves is to lash out, then they're going to do that. And we need to keep that in mind with regard to safety. So moving on with some site selection concerns or thoughts that are here is, has the property been trapped previously? And if you're trapping your own property, you'll definitely know that. But if you're trapping a property that's new to you, talk to the landowner and find out where trap locations have been previously and whether or not those trap locations have been successful. Because unsuccessful trap locations quite likely means that those feral hogs have been educated in that area. And it's going to make it extremely difficult to entice those pigs back into to a trap, regardless of the type of trap, in an area where they have been educated. So think about what's been successful and what hasn't. If it's worked there in the past, it's one of those things that we say all the time. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So if it's worked in the past, keep using it. And if it hasn't worked in the past, we need to think about what we need to do to change that up. The other thought that comes to mind here, where I'm at along the Texas Gulf Coast, is aerial gunning a possibility over the property that you may be trapping? And what I mean by that is that everybody likes to pick the low-hanging fruit. So whenever folks find out and they know that you're conditioning pigs in a given area, that just means that there's going to be a super high concentration of pigs in a very, very localized area. And that makes it really easy pickings whenever you have aerial gunners that can fly over an area and be extremely successful on the work that you've conducted. So again, too, that's one of those things that you keep your trap locations kind of close to your chest and don't let anybody know where you're trapping at. And if you have to, where I'm at now is we may need to tuck the traps up under some cover so that they're not as visible whenever aircraft are overhead. So some of the things to keep in mind with that regard are just, everybody likes to take advantage of somebody else's hard work. So will you be hauling the pigs alive? That's something that always we need to keep in mind. There's only a handful of states that are, less than a handful of states that allow that. And the thing that you need to ask yourself first and foremost is it legal where you are? Some states have it where those animals, that's not a legal option to move them alive. Where I'm at in the state of Texas, yeah, we can move them alive with state laws that that guide what we can and cannot do. So if we do have that ability, we need to make sure that roads are adequate to the trap location, and make sure that that trap is oriented correctly in the direction that it needs to be, which means that seam needs to be facing where you have the opportunity to back that trailer up. If you are going to be loading those animals out and moving them somewhere alive, you need to build the load structure in when you set the trap up. Putting the load structure in whenever you've got pigs in the trap is definitely an exercise in futility. What we need to do in that situation, or in that setup situation, is if you're going to build in load chutes or load gates or anything like that into there off of that seam that's already existing on the trap, you need to do that at the time that that you're building that trap and putting it in place. So that kind of wraps up the site selection side of things, and then we're going to move into the trap maintenance. With regard to maintenance, what we want to do is make sure that we take those traps down if they're going to be unused for extended periods of time. And what I mean by extended periods of time, if you're going to leave those traps unused for a month, 6 weeks, things like that, then that's what we want to do. We want to take those traps down. That's a perfect opportunity to clean them up, to check them out, make sure everything is still in perfect functioning order. The other thing is too, I mean, with the Pig Brig, everything is UV coated, so we're not really so much worried too much about the sunlight, but we want to make sure that we maximize trap longevity by treating that piece of equipment the way that it needs to be treated. So extended period of times, take them down. We can think about storage. 30-gallon totes, those plastic 30-gallon totes, Rubbermaid totes, whatever you want to call it, that's sufficient to store that trap in, and all the way up to a 50-gallon tote. Anything above a 50-gallon is a little bit much. But what we want to keep in mind is we don't want to use bags, tow sacks, any kind of other bags or anything like that rats can chew through, because those rats definitely like to try to make nests where they don't need to be making nests. So I do know that in some of the deep south where humidity is extremely high all the time, it's tough to get those traps dry whenever we store them, and we want to make sure that we store those traps as dry as possible. If we store traps that are damp or wet or anything like that, it's not going to take long before it starts to mold and mildew. And a couple of things that's going to do is, obviously, we all know that we put water on something, it's going to decay it a lot quicker. The other thing that's going to come to mind is that whenever we start building up mildew or mold on those traps and we break it out of storage to go put it back up, that's a new smell that those pigs are going to have to get used to in the area. That may push those pigs back a little bit. So if you're going to store traps in those totes and those closed-in totes for a prolonged period of time, every so often, every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, just take the top off of that tote, let it air dry, and get some of that moisture off before you put that lid back on. So we did talk about storage and checking that trap for damage and repair. Make those repairs as soon as you see them and during the time that you're cleaning those traps up. That way, whenever it comes time to put that trap back in the field again, that's just one less step you got to take. And I know that whenever we notice pigs move back in an area, we want to get on them super quick and make sure that we don't miss that window to get those pigs caught and taken care of. So get those repairs taken care of really quickly. Now, the next thing, we have a couple of questions that have come in before, that what do we put in the container to make sure that we prolong that longevity? And the answer to that is nothing. We don't want to put anything in that container with that trap, like mothballs or anything like that. Obviously, we have a smell concern there. So as long as that trap is stored dry and is stored appropriately, then we don't worry about anything in that container that's going to be an additive that you have to think about. Last thing on maintenance that what comes to mind is that whenever we put that trap up, we take it out of service for a little while, check those ground anchors and make sure that none of those cabled anchors are kinked. Anything that's kinked on those ground anchors, that's just a weak spot. It takes a lot to kink a cable, but whenever it is kinked and over a prolonged period of time of being used and stretched with the pigs and that Pig Brig, it may end up being a breaking point that we can avoid just by checking it ahead of time. So we're moving on, I guess, to the last component of this part of the program, or this part of this webinar, and we're going to do is we're going to talk about trapping an area. And what we don't want to do is we've already talked about this previously about not putting it in an obvious feeding or bedding area. And so we're going to move on through that part. But what I want to make sure that we pay attention to, the next one, is trap in proximity of significant food sources, if not in the winter months. And what I mean by not in the winter months is if you look at that next little bullet point down there, one of the things it says is a significant food source is deer feeders. Deer feeders in the fall and the winter, there's in the southern United States, there's a deer feeder on every 10 acres of land out there. So there is a plethora of food on the landscape just with deer feeders everywhere. Also in the wintertime, if we have heavy mass production with oak trees or pecans or anything like that, that's going to scatter those pigs in vast areas or livestock feeding locations. So if we're in the summertime like we are now, getting into the summer times, yeah, we want to focus on those food sources that are more significant. In the fall and the winter time, we just want to look at the available resources. If our mass production is starting to get picked up quickly, then yeah, we really can't go wrong in those fall and winter points as far as where we locate a trap site, because those animals will come. So the other thing to keep in mind in the wintertime or in extremely wet periods of the year is try to place that trap on high or higher ground. Usually it's going to be in your wetter periods of the time that what we're thinking about is yeah, we want to keep those traps up out of the mud and keep those traps as dry as possible, or keep them as light as possible, where those skirts and those nets move the way they're supposed to. So those wetter periods of the year, think about high spots in the area that you may be trapping, and keep those spots at a little higher for I guess in your back pocket for later usage, and then use those lower elevations, those lower sites to trap whenever you're dry or getting dry, and it obviously be closer to a water. One of the things that we do whenever we try to locate pigs or try to get pigs to respond to a bait location is, instead of me going out and putting up a big recipe together to feed pigs every single day, we may put a recipe together that'll fit into a 3-pound coffee can, and soak a sponge or a rag with whatever that recipe that you like to use is, and then put that sponge or a rag on the top of that trap cap, or hang it into the trees and allow the wind to disperse that bait over that landscape. Quite frequently, we'll see pigs be caught after a wind change. They may have been bedding in the opposite direction than you thought that they were, and with that bait smell above the ground and elevated like that, and that wind change, it'll blow that smell back to where those animals are, and you'll watch them walk in with their heads up, and they're trying to track down that odor. So the last couple of things of what we need to think about here in today, before we turn it over to the side, is be cautious of additives and attractants. And what I mean by that is if you didn't start with them, be cautious about adding them. I know a lot of folks will start out with the recipe that they like, and halfway through the trapping effort, they'll get tired of having to put that concoction together, and they'll quit. And a lot of times those animals will back away. It's just like if you have a favorite restaurant and you can tell immediately whenever they change cooks, something's not quite right. So whenever you start out with an additive or attractant, stay with it throughout the duration of that trapping effort. And if you do end up having pigs go off feed, and you're not using additives or attractants, be very, very cautious about adding it. The first thing we need to do is find out why they quit coming to that feed or that recipe to begin with. There could be a ton of different options that we'll discuss a couple of months down the road about why those pigs may do what they do. So just be cautious. Other things to think about is non-gel based attractants, or do not use gel-based attractants during the warmer months. What we think about when we're using gel-based attractants in the warmer months is obviously they hold moisture really, really well. And you put gel-based attractants on the ground to attract pigs. And in the southern United States, we are blessed with the red imported fire ant. And before you can ever get in the truck and get away from that trap site, a lot of times those ants are already over the top of that gel-based attractant. Once those ants are over the top of that gel-based attractant, those pigs are going to shy away from that. So if you're using attractants in the summer months, make sure it's something that's water soluble, that carries the smell, but not the gel that can attract those animals or those ants. And where I'm at right now, we're in a pretty extensive drought, and anything and everything out there is looking for a moisture source. So those gel-based attractants obviously holding moisture, and they attract ants and other things extremely quickly. Do not cut corners on conditioning. People ask, how long does it take to condition pigs? I don't use a calendar or a clock to tell me how long it needs to condition pigs. Whenever I condition pigs, I look at that bottom note right there. I'm going to keep conditioning pigs until I have at least 80+% of that sounder feeding comfortably within the confines of that trap before I lower that trap to that catch mode. If that may take 2 days, that's great. It may take 2 weeks. That's going to have to be what we do, because we're looking at how do we catch as many of those animals in a shorter period of time as what we can, in that catch mode. So the thing to keep in mind statistically is that we'll catch 95+% of our pigs within the first 4 nights. So what that means is that if you catch pigs tonight, only go after those pigs about 3 more nights before you put that trap back into that conditioning mode. Whenever you put that trap back in that conditioning mode, you bait it 1 more time. That way, the animals that you did not catch, the last memory they have of that trap is a free meal that you put it back in a conditioning mode, which then in turn shortens the conditioning duration the next time you go out there to catch those pigs, which may only be 10 days or 2 weeks later, but it shortens up that conditioning period considerably. So those are a couple of things that what we thought we wanted to share with you tonight. And I know it's kind of quick, down and dirty, and threw a lot of things at you, kind of like drinking from a fire hose. We may pick up a few things, but a lot of it kind of gets past us. So what we want to do at this point is kind of look through, and Vicki, if you would help me out on this Q&A side of things to see, do we have any questions or do we not? And on my side, I'm not seeing any of the questions in the Q&A, but if you have any there, jump on there real quick, put them in. And obviously one of the things we want you to do is as you move forward and may have questions later on, is throw those questions to us. I mean, we can incorporate those questions and the answers to those questions as we move on to later webinar series and so forth. And while we're waiting on some folks to see if they're going to throw anything on those Q&As, is the next thing that you need to put on your calendar is June the 23rd. June the 23rd will be the next webinar starting at the same time. And the topic for next month is going to be the history and biology of wild pigs or feral hogs. And what we're going to do is extensively cover the reproduction, so forth and so on, of those animals, and discuss kind of what drives the machine and what makes pigs tick, what makes them what they are. So
I got a couple questions, Aaron.
Okay, go for it.
I'm excited to read these off. The first one is from Carlton, and he's asking, how do you set it in a cattle pasture?
Okay, the first thing I'm gonna go back into is ask that question is, do you have the opportunity in a rotation environment? If those cattle are going to be rotated through and in that pasture, and if you're rotating, just rotate or put that trap up behind the rotation. That way your animals have your cattle have removed as much vegetation off the ground as you can, and then put that trap up behind that rotation. It's going to increase your efficiencies much quickly. No rotation, Carlton, I see there on no rotation. The one thing that we need to think about there, if there is no rotation, is think about where those cattle typically loaf. What I mean by loafing is if it's getting hot right now, where do they typically go to shade at? It may be in the back 40, the back corner of where those animals use less frequently, and then make sure that we tuck that back in that corner and stay out of sight. I mean, if it's in something that they can get to readily available, then yeah, they may get up there and just be cautious and be in the way periodically throughout the day. But that's something that we want to kind of keep in mind. The other thing to think about is that if we do have, like we see sometimes some issues with yearling cattle, 600, 700 pound cattle that are just teenage cattle, basically, if you want to put it in context, they are just like teenagers. They're going to get into junk no matter what we do. So what we'll do, if you'll go to the Pig Brig site and look under the education tab there and some of the videos and whatnot that we've got there, is I'll use a 1 or a 1/2 inch electric tape, electrobraid tape, and run a single strand of electric wire around that trap about where the anchors go in the ground at, and make sure that you don't go below 36 inches on that electric tape, or you'll get down to where those pigs can reach it. But that one single strand of electric fence, it doesn't take long, and those animals realize what that is. And then after that, you condition those animals, and you can really keep those animals back with just a 3/4 or 3/8 inch white rope after that point. But extremely good question there, that what we need to do to kind of keep those animals back. But typically tuck it away out of sight, out of mind for those cattle that are loafing in the hot part of the day. And then if you got yearling cattle that are out there, it may be something that you got to keep an eye on and stick you a hot wire up there and keep them pushed back. So if that didn't answer you anything appropriately, then definitely reach out, give me a call, and we can address it a little bit more and then bring it back to the group next time. Vicki, I see I got one up there that says issues placing in knee-high grass.
You don't need me. Keep going. Yep.
No, I'm good. No, it's just I'm going to make sure I didn't miss anybody up above that.
No.
So
you keep going.
The one thing that what I'm going to do if I'm placing a trap in knee-high grass or anything like that is I'm going to pay attention to where that skirt's going to fall on the ground. And whenever I start baiting pigs inside the confines of that T-post, I'm going to put the majority of the bait in the conditioning mode. While I'm conditioning pigs, I'm going to put the majority of that bait in that high grass where the skirt's going to fall. That way it will keep those animals, or keep that those pigs in that conditioning feeding, will remove a lot of that extremely high grass very, very quickly. They're going to get every kernel of bait out of that grass that's there. So it doesn't take long for those animals to get that high grass out of the way, and just pay attention to where you know that skirting is going to fall, and that's where your conditioning bait will go. And then whenever it turns to set that trap, then obviously we'll move that baiting onto the interior of that trap, away from where that skirting lays on the ground. Let's see, Vicki, I'm going on down to.
Do you want me to read them to you, Aaron? Is that easier? The next one is any considerations beyond T-post length for setting the trap in light soils, sandy loam or sand?
Well, and that's one of the things that we're thinking about with setting it in light soils like that, is obviously that it's going to be something that those animals can root around in and move around in a lot easier. So what we want to do is the main thing is making sure that skirting stays tight to the ground, that we can make sure that we use the adequate length of the post, that we watch how those pigs are interacting with that soil during the conditioning feeding, and make sure that you adapt accordingly if those pigs show that you need to adapt. And some of those adapting techniques we can discuss on an individual basis, because we need to know kind of what you're seeing and what you're facing in order to make sure that we give you the best advice possible. So if you're in those deep sugar sands, those light soils, soft soils, definitely watch those animals and see what they're doing. And if there's something that we need to discuss on a case-by-case basis, we're glad to do that to make sure that you're successful.
All right, Aaron, the next one is if you're conditioning near a deer feeding site, can you first put up the posts before adding the trap?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the things that you can do too, is that the benefit of the Pig Brig is that you can go out and put T-post up in a half a dozen different locations and move that trap to wherever the pigs show up, move the net itself to where the pigs show up. So if you're trapping around a deer feeder, or you're going to be hunting that area during the fall of the year, and instead of going out in the fall of the year and worrying about your deer movement, go ahead and put those T-posts up during the summertime now through August, whenever you're not so much worried about being quiet in an area, and get those feeder posts or those trap posts put in place, and making sure that you pay attention to where those animals are at and how they're using that. But whenever you're conditioning those pigs close to a deer feeder location, make sure whenever you do start conditioning those pigs, you turn that deer feeder off to encourage those animals to go on over to where that Pig Brig is set up.
Okay, the next one is, are there alternate baits to use in the summertime? Here in North Carolina, there are cornfields at every turn. Farmers are wanting Hogs trap because of destruction of their fields, but I typically use corn as bait. No concoction seems to work. What are your suggestions?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's tough whenever we have adequate nutrition all over the landscape. And some of those periods of time, it's just tough to try to get animals to come anywhere that you want them to be. The main thing is just going to be consistent, and not feeling that you're pressured into doing one thing over another. Anything that's going to be something new can entice those pigs. And me personally, sometimes if I'm looking at those extremely plentiful food sources like corn and other agriculture crops, I've gone in and used distiller's grain. If you've got a local beer brewery or a winery or anything like that, is use those distiller's grains, and they're looking for a way to get rid of that. And that's a different smell, a different odor, a different approach. But the main thing is that in one of those is being consistent, one. And the second thing is going to be, there may be times of the year, rather than trying to force those animals to go to your trapping locations, is to back away from them. The more we push those animals, the more we may push them away or educate them. So just be patient, be cautious about what you do, that what you do now, you don't make a bad situation later by educating those pigs.
Okay, up next is it common for the anchor stakes to be bent after a catch? I think we deal with that a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of those things, that those anchor stakes, they're half-inch rod. Those anchor stakes, they will bend quite often. And the thing is that a half-inch rod will bend just like a 1-inch rod will. And it's a heck of a lot tougher to straighten out a 1-inch rod to get that rod to flow the way that it needs to, as opposed to a 1/2 inch rod, whenever you can straighten it out really easily and get it right back into production really quickly. One thing we don't want to do with those 1/2 inch rods, if they bend, don't heat treat those rods. If you know what I'm talking about with heat treating, what heat treating is going to do is remove the pliability of that metal to bend, and it's going to make it brittle. It'll make it extremely hard, but it'll make it brittle, and those anchors will start breaking off. So they're intended that it's known that they're going to bend on you. It just makes it a lot easier to fix, but don't heat treat it to make it worse.
Okay, the next one is, are you going to send out a Zoom link for the next webinar on June 23rd?
Absolutely. We will be sending out a Zoom link on the 23rd event. One of the things to kind of keep in mind, to keep an eye out for all of you that are on today, is that you will be getting I guess, a notification, an email following this one, to ask you a couple of questions, what we need to do better, so forth and so on, and to remind you of the June 23rd date. And yes, you will be getting another email out there to remind you about registering for that one as well.
Okay, I'm going to keep going, Aaron. How close have traps been successfully deployed simultaneously, and how far apart were they?
That's a good thing, a good question to ask. And I do a lot of this is that whenever we have an animal, and typically it's going to happen is if it's breeding time of the year, you're going to see a dominant boars in with sows all over everywhere. Where we're seeing things right now is that those females have had those little ones, and you got it, or they're heavy bred, and in either case they're not reproductively open. So those big boars have gone back to those territorial, I guess, setups. So what you'll see is that those big boars being caught first may cause those females to avoid a trap and not want to go into a trap where there's a big boar already at, which it makes perfect sense. So in that situation, what I'll do is I'll put a trap up and have a given trap in a given location, and then just merely go over 100 yards away and put a second trap up. And whenever depending on what we catch, if we catch that big boar first and those other animals doesn't want to go into that trap with that big boar in there, then literally they're only 100 yards away from a second trap. And that definitely shortens the duration of how many days you have to go after those pigs. And we'll still catch multiple sounders in that very confined location in a given night. But that's an extremely good point to bring up is yeah, that at certain times of the year, if those animals are not compatible with one another, then they will try to avoid. But two traps in a close proximity will increase those efficiencies pretty quickly.
The next one is, what is your favorite bait to use, and what do you do to discourage deer from going into your trap?
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with just a dry corn, and obviously the reason I do it is just it's convenience. If I'm baiting 15 traps in a day, I don't want to smell like fermented corn all day long. But if I'm going to go out and I'm only trapping a trap or a location or two, then I'm going to use a fermented corn, and I'm only going to ferment enough to be able to use within a couple of days, or it's going to go from fermented to rotten. And that's something that we don't want to have. Our pigs are going to start shying away from once that bait gets to a rotted stage. What I'm going to do to avoid deer is that, one, I'm either going to condition that trap with it all the way up, and then whenever I get ready to go set that trap, I'm going to go all the way down, and I'm not going to gradually decrease that. In the spring and the summertime, it's not nearly as important or significant to do it that way as it is in the fall of the year. So what we need to think about in discouraging deer is if put it in the context of a cow. If you've got a 1,300-pound cow on one side of the gate and a sack of feed on the other side of the gate, obviously the cow is going to walk through the gate to get to the feed. If you slowly shut that gate over a given period of time, that cow is going to still force their way through that gate. The same concept with regard to the fall of the year when bucks have hard antlers. If you gradually lower that trap down, then if that net is only 10 inches off the ground and you've got a 16-inch wide buck, they're still going to try to force their way under that trap. So keep it all the way up or all the way down, especially during the fall of the year. Now, to avoid the deer completely, what I do is I bait traps as close to dark as I can. And whenever I condition those pigs, baiting traps as close to dark as I can, I leave the motor running on my truck or on the side-by-side or on the four-wheeler. I keep my radio going. I'm talking to whoever's with me. Those animals, those pigs are going to get acclimated to your behavior, and it will not take them long at all until they know that as that sound of that engine fades off in the distance, there's food on the table. So if I bait closer to dark and they get acclimated to my activity, quite likely you're going to have pigs caught within a very, very short period of time after you leave, thus shortening the duration that deer have access to that trap. So I don't ever bait the trap, set the trap in the morning after I've removed pigs out, because that gives deer all day long to access that trap. So it's just being consistent in that conditioning time. Pigs will acclimate to you, and you remove that or shorten that duration that deer have access.
Next one, we got two more questions. How do you outcompete deer feeders without cutting them off completely? Do you recommend pig exclosures in this situation?
Well, one of the things of what I do to keep pigs back from my deer feeders is I put a feeder pen up around them anyway, and those feeder pens like that can be built any size. If you want to still keep pigs coming to your deer feeder to hunt over during hunting season, just make the feeder pen the size that's going to still allow corn to be thrown outside that pen, but the large majority of it is not going to be accessible to those pigs. If you doesn't have the ability to put feeder pens up around your deer feeders, then your trap is in close proximity, then what I do is I would decrease the spin time on that feeder, thus decreasing the amount of feed on the ground. If you've got a sounder of 20 pigs that's working an area, and that feeder only puts 2 or 3 pounds on the ground, after a little while, a couple of days of that, you're going to only have just a handful of pigs are going to waste their time going to that deer feeder whenever they know that there may be 15 or 20 pounds of bait on the ground really, really closely under that brig. So that's just going to be something that you'll play with as you see how those pigs, I guess, adapt to that location.
Okay. Up next is somebody from West Texas near San Angelo. All the hogs are in the riparian forest now, and he says that seems like a good area to set up the trap, kind of near it or in it. He says, talk a little bit more about the bedding area for hogs in a riparian forest and how to trap around it.
Sure, you bet. Yeah, that riparian area is something that's very sensitive, and it's very much an ecosystem of its own. So what I do whenever I'm trapping a riparian area is I do not want to put my traps right there on that streamside bed, because I don't want that intrusion of bacteria or possible disease runoff coming from pigs that could be harboring those diseases or parasites or whatnot getting into that water. I also don't want to encourage sedimentation in that stream or that location. And then also too, we have pigs in a trap location that's close to a waterway like that. You're encouraging erosion whenever that waterway gets out of banks and starts to erode away. So what I'm going to do is, if I'm trapping a riparian area, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get an idea of the flow of those pigs, where they're coming from, where they're going to, and then sometimes pigs will even set up precedent on one side of that riparian area or the other. The other thing that I'm going to look at in trapping a riparian area is a lot of times that those bends and those creeks and those flows, there'll be a slower sloping side, and a lot of times, I know where you're talking about in San Angelo, and those bends that along those waterways may have an unbelievable pecan bottom, and I'll try to use those bottoms and those bends like that give me a little bit wider berth away from that riparian area, to put those traps in those wider berths, to get as far away from that water as possible. But what I'll do is I'll always try to trap on the slower sloping side, to avoid the erosion potential and the runoff of getting any contaminants in that waterway.
Okay, I've got just a couple more come in. The next one is, can you go over cleaning of dirty traps before storing the trap? What's the
Absolutely.
best?
One of the things that I'll do whenever I'm trapping pigs is, and pull that trap down, it gets a thorough cleaning. And whenever I get that thorough cleaning, then what I'll do is I'll take, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the big molasses tubs, the big blue or black molasses tubs that are intended for cattle. I'll take that tub, put that trap in the tub and fill it up and let it set in that tub for, I don't know, a couple of hours, and to break down any of the dirt or the mud or anything like that could have built up in the mesh. And then once I get that I guess soaking time, I'll take that trap out, take that net out, and I'll use a pressure washer that I have here at the house. I'll pressure wash that trap, knock the rest of the dirt, the mud, and whatnot off of that trap, and then either lay it out in the open full sun to let it dry, or hang it on a fence to make sure that we get plenty of airflow through there. And depending on where you're at and how humid it is, that's going to dictate how long it needs to happen. But but it doesn't take very long. Fill that tub up, let it soak for a little while, and then 15 minutes or 10 minutes or so with pressurized water, and it'll clean things out.
I got another one that's, can you trap multiple times at the same site? What do you do with the blood? Do you need to clean the site?
Absolutely. I personally have caught pigs in the same site for up to 19 nights in a row without moving the trap. And what we do whenever we think about that is, and we'll talk about this in events moving forward a lot more in detail, but one of the things I do is I only use a caliber that's sufficient for the job. I definitely do not use deer rifles or shotguns or anything like that. And then we think about shot placement that's going to minimize bloodlet. And with that, in wintertime, cold times of the year, I'm not concerned about bloodlet at all. In the summer times, the warmer months of the year, if I catch 20, 25 pigs in a trap, what I'm going to pay attention to before I bait the trap again is if there's significant amounts of blood in the floor of that trap. And if it is, then I'll kick a little dirt over the top of it if it's dry, or I'll stomp it into the mud if it's wet, and the soil microbes will have that blood broken down really quickly. So you can still smell that pigs have been there, but there's no decay that they can smell in that trap area. But that's something that's minimal. We really don't need to worry about that a whole lot. In pigs, if they're nervous, they're nervous. It's going to be hard to get them to coming in anyway. But yes, I can definitely catch pigs in the same location, and it's just going to be how you manage that location. The other thing that I do to trap pigs in a given area for a prolonged period of time is I never ever drive up to the trap. Never drive to the trap, because obviously that's going to spook those pigs. Anything that you did not catch and you drive up to that trap, it's going to spook those animals, may keep them pushed away for a longer period of time. The other thing that you may end up having is those animals that if you have a trap that doesn't have a cap on it, and you have a lot of those 15, 20, 25 pigs that may be in the trap, and they start literally piggybacking on the other side of the trap, you may have one go over the top. Whereas if you walk up to the trap, they'll see you from a distance, and by the time you get there, a lot of that intense movement's going to dissipate, and those animals are going to be a lot more approachable. So, yeah, trapping in a given area for multiple nights is definitely doable, but there is a methodology to make it work.
All righty, that excuse me, that looks like it's about it, Aaron. Thanks for that. Those are all the questions. Cool.
So yeah, Vicki, that's what we'll do. I guess we'll just make sure that we get everybody the links ahead of time on the 23rd event. Another, just in closing, folks, just if you think that there's some of these events that are coming up, like the next one's going to be history and biology, you know, people that may be of interest to these topics, it may be interesting to them, pass the word. And I mean, the more the merrier, and make this kind of a community.
Topic ideas.
I'm sorry?
Let us know topic ideas.
Yes, definitely. If you got topic ideas, we will be posting the 12-month schedule of what's coming up down the road. That way, it kind of get your mouth start to watering about what we're going to be talking about next, and some of those questions that you may start mulling over before we ever even get to the event.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. Super excited to see
Thank y'all. Appreciate it. Yeah. You have a good night.
Good night.